By the time the cavalry arrived at the ford, fully 24 hours had passed since the battle. All the Nez Perces had crossed the Clearwater and were safely making camp, with their horses grazing on a distant hillside. Spotting the approaching column, warriors hid in the riverside rocks, and as the cavalry drew within range, they opened a heavy fire that sent some riders galloping for safety, and others jumping from their saddles to hide in a wheat field. The shooters laughed and jeered. One warrior later called this a fun war, and Howard later admitted that the humiliation was, quote, a fierce delight to our foe. The hoots continued as the army's howitzers lobbed shells harmlessly toward the new camp. This was the moment as he was taunted by an enemy he had let out of his grip. When Howard wrote so confidently that he was about, quote, to make thorough work, unquote, of the hostiles and quickly bring them to heel. His best chance now was to make up what he had lost by somehow getting himself across the river and behind the bands, between them and Lolo Pass, and after losing another day considering his poor options, he left much of his command in camp, rest for the weary soul would pend, and made his try. He feinted one way and then led a column down the Clearwater, planning to cross by ferry and then head back upstream by a trail that would put him at Weeipee Prairie at the base of Lolo Pass. He had barely started on the 40-mile march, however, when he learned that the bands had packed up and were heading to Weeipee, sure to get there long before him. He turned around and returned to camp. If Howard had given the Nez Perces a temporary reprieve, their troubles still ran far deeper than this. Where am I? True, their immediate situation seemed positive. They had scored lopsided victories and outmaneuvered their opponents. They had killed 8 enemy combatants for every man, woman, and child they had lost. In their hasty retreat, they had left behind teepees and supplies, but they had lost few men and had kept most of their horses. Yet the terrible truth was that all their success only highlighted how desperate their condition was. The lesson of the Clearwater was that they could not stand up to sustained confrontation, either for 48 hours of fighting or for weeks of maneuvering around their home country. There were only so many places to go, so many rivers to put between themselves and the army, so many ways to jog onto so many unpredicted routes. Worse, leaders had to make these military moves while seeing to the basic needs of several hundred persons of all ages and conditions, and equally important, about 2,000 horses, the irreplaceable living tools in both war and peace. They could expect no help. Local whites talked anxiously of others joining the fight, but the other Nez Perce bands were firmly against the resistors, and the region's other tribes had seen their own power broken up earlier, when the Nez Perces had stood apart and let them go down alone. Their basic problem was that they had long ago lost command of what had been their home, and now was their military theater, which left them in the fix common to all Native America. How do you sustain a way of life without controlling that life stage and its crops? Their enemies moved as they wished and ultimately controlled most needful things. Given that, anything the Nez Perces did, no matter how brilliant and star-blessed, could only postpone disaster. Opinions differed on what to do. Joseph reportedly was indecisive and depressed. His band was the farthest from home, and the odds of ever seeing it again, think of your country, the dying old Joseph had told his son, seemed remote. Apparently, he weighed ending the fight. Right after Howard heard that the Nez Perces had decamped, he got other startling news. Joseph was considering surrender. The next day, July 15th, an emissary crossed the Clearwater to visit the general, who said that Joseph could expect a fair hearing with a military tribunal, but only if he surrendered unconditionally. Howard was so confident that the end was at hand that he selected Miller to receive the chief in his arms, but July 16th came and went without any sign of Joseph. Howard later wrote that Joseph had snookered him, using the surrender ruse to keep the troops in place while he got a head start, a line of thinking that once again assumed that Joseph, the master strategist, was in sole command. More likely, Joseph honestly considered giving up, but stayed the course because others pressed him to, and because of what might happen to his people at the army's hands. Leaders of other Northwestern wars, most recently Captain Jack of the Modocs, had been hanged. Oh my goodness. Leaders of the other Northwestern wars, most recently Captain Jack of the Modocs, had been hanged, an especially horrifying death in those cultures. Given that Howard had not exactly built up a reservoir of trust, hearing, quote, unconditional surrender, unquote, must have been worrisome. Others persisted in their hostility. A council was held at Weeyippie Prairie on the night of July 15th. The mood must have been a mixture of anger, frustration, jumpiness, and defiance. No one spoke for surrender. Some called for a thrust westward back to the wild, rough country along the Snake River. The more argued for heading in the opposite direction, east over Lolo Pass to Montana. The trail was familiar, with steep inclines and heavy timber, ideal for defense, and on the other side were more horses and their longtime friends, the Flatheads. Still, crossing Lolo Pass was a sobering commitment. The face-off with the government had come down to two issues: living independently and keeping their homelands. Start up that trail, the leaders knew, and the one might be possible, but the price would be giving up the other for an indefinite time.